Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. I'm very excited. When I was given the opportunity to speak with you all this morning about power dynamics, I was legitimately at a loss with how I should start out. For me, someone who is always talking way too much and enjoys to talk as much as I do, this is somewhat strange. Initially, I felt inclined to start off in talking about how 2020 has just been the worst. From the raging pandemic to the increased and ever-present outrage concerning the ongoing oppression of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to an election that seems like it is just never gonna end, it's never gonna go away, 2020 has just been entirely too much, and not in a good way. But no. Starting out with the doom and gloom that is 2020 seems far too cliche and obvious. So then I thought about, maybe I should just come straight, no chaser, with stats and with facts. So maybe I should open up announcing that, as Cedric said, I'm broadcasting from the suburbs of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We're about 50 miles down the road. On August 23rd of this year, Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by a Kenosha police officer, all while Mr. Blake was retreating to his vehicle with his children sitting in the back seat. Or maybe I should start with talking about Breonna Taylor, the Louisville EMT shot to death in her home, who to this day has yet to receive justice. Breonna's case is deeply personal to me. Because Louisville is a place that I called home for a very significant portion of my life. I attended the University of Louisville, and it just causes me to think like, that could have been me. How about we start off talking about racist systems in America, like we just heard about, to include the criminal justice system. A study conducted by Harvard University in June of this year found that Black Americans are over 3 times more likely than white Americans to be killed by police. When it comes to incarceration, according to the Sentencing Project, African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate of more than 5 times that of whites. But this still doesn't seem like the right way to start off this conversation, because what about anything that I just said is new? Or what about anything that I just said is shocking? This is how life in America has always been for people of color. So no, this is still not the right way to start this conversation. So after thinking about it more, I decided I should just stick to what I know best and let my geek flag fly. We're talking about power dynamics, right? Right? So it only seems fitting to talk about some of the most powerful individuals in all of popular culture, right? Am I right? I'm gonna do it anyway. So when I say I'm all kinds of nerdy and geeky, I mean it. I mean it. I really, really mean it. So I'd like to open our discussion today with a quote from one of the most influential superheroes of our time, the Black Panther. So, released in 2018, the Oscar-winning film Black Panther introduced one of the most prolific Black figures in comics to mainstream audiences. Portrayed by the late, great Chadwick Boseman, T'Challa, aka the Black Panther, is the king of the fictional sovereign nation of Wakanda. At the end of the film, we see T'Challa addressing the United Nations, and in the course of this address, he says the following: "We all know the truth. More connects us than separates us. But in times of crisis, the wise build bridges while the foolish build barriers. We must find a way to look after one another as if we were one single tribe." Now, this is one of my most favorite quotes because its very essence promotes inclusivity. In fact, I love this quote so much that I thought it would be beneficial for us to dissect it in our conversation this morning concerning power dynamics and how we can work collectively to change them. So first, let's start with the phrase, "We all know the truth. More connects us than separates us." Much like the therapist that I am, I understand this statement in many different ways. On the one hand, perhaps there is more that connects us than that which separates us. According to this model of personal identity development developed by Dr. Dale Su and colleagues, there are 3 different levels to our identity. Each person has individual, group, and universal level identity characteristics. And we can see from the image here that the innermost circle does it looks like it's smaller than the other 2. So if there is more that connects us, what do we do with all this stuff on the outside? All of the stuff that is not connecting, or the stuff that's unique? Do we just disregard this in some way? Interestingly enough, that is what the powers that be in America have been doing since our country's inception. When confronted by things that are different, or those things that work to separate us, those in power in America have historically and continuously worked to eradicate those differences. Moving on to the next sentence in the quote, we bring our attention to the following phrase: "But in times of crisis, the wise build bridges while the foolish build barriers." I feel like truer words have never been spoken. Maybe, kind of. Allow me to explain. In theory, this is absolutely amazing. A wonderful, charming, and awesome idea. In practice, though, not true, doesn't happen, not so much. Ideally, again, in theory, when we're confronted with something other than ourselves, we would, as aforementioned, focus on that which connects us and work to build more bridges of connection and to overcome barriers. Again, this is all in theory. What we have seen throughout history, however, in America, has been not only the building of barriers, but the reinforcement and legalization of those barriers. In America, these manifestations of barrier building can also be understood as ethnocentric multiculturalism, which has 5 major components. The first being the belief in the superiority of the dominant group. The second being the belief in the inferiority of all others. The third being the power to impose standards. The fourth, a manifestation in institutions, as we just heard in the presentation before. And then lastly, the invisible veil. So the invisible veil refers to one's worldview or collection of values and beliefs that often operate outside of our conscious awareness. So as such, people in power tend to assume that their experiences are universal. So my truth, my experiences, it's the same as everybody else, right? Black people, indigenous folks, other people of color, they all have the exact same experiences as white people, right? Am I right? Absolutely not. Wrong. Very, very wrong. In fact, America could be one of the contributing authors to a book on ethnocentric multiculturalism. Historically, this was manifested in the very founding of this nation, in which Columbus sailed the ocean blue and decided he liked this land that he discovered, so that the natives living on this land had to be dealt with. Throughout history, this dealing with Native Americans has involved the outright erasure of their culture, from the seizure of lands, to the genocide, to the forcing of Western values, and the obliteration of Native customs and languages. In addition, Black people were brought to this land in chains over 400 years ago. To this day, many argue that those chains have yet to be fully destroyed, but have just changed shape. Slavery has evolved into separate but equal and Jim Crow laws, and even still into mass incarceration, redlining, microaggressions, and economic disparity. Moreover, still, marriage equality did not come to fruition until 2015. Immigrants and asylum seekers are met with suspicion and outrage as opposed to care and compassion. And women are still fighting for equal pay. So what do all these groups have in common, you ask yourself? Native Americans, Black Americans, the LGBTQIA+ community, immigrants, and women. All of these groups occupy one or even perhaps many marginalized identities. And as such, these groups do not have the power to make change on their own. At one point in history or another, or even currently, each of these groups were or are believed to be inferior. So if we want to work on building bridges and less so on erecting barriers, those in positions of power have to get involved. Now let's move on to the final phrase in T'Challa's quote: "We must find a way to look after one another as if we were one single tribe." Again, in theory, this sounds amazing. All of the different peoples of the world gathered around the proverbial bonfire, singing Kumbaya, living together in harmony and bliss. Even though I am a very cynical person, I really hate to sound so cynical here. But as a Black millennial living in America, I just do not see how this is ever going to be possible. I mean, Black people have been advocating for the redistribution of wealth and power for the last 400 years. And what do we really have to show for it? Now, pedagogies concerning equity and inclusion emerged in the 1970s, and at that time were mostly focused on multiculturalism, which promoted this idea that the diversity of America should be recognized. The salad bowl metaphor comes to mind here. There's a lot of different people, a lot of different ingredients, but very little blending. Now, between the 1990s and the 2010s, the focus shifted to diversity, meaning we should all be trying to surround ourselves with people that are not like us. So in this period, we saw the development of like affirmative action laws. So again, here the emphasis is on recognizing and including diverse individuals, but there's no mention of how marginalized groups should be valued. Fast forward to present day, we are now more focused on issues of equity and justice. In so doing, we have to acknowledge the deeply embedded systems of racism and discrimination that have served to subjugate Black, Indigenous, and people of color over time. Systems, mind you, that were cultivated and maintained by individuals in power. So given this newfound emphasis we have on equitable treatment and practices, how do we move forward? First and foremost, in addition to acknowledging difference, we must learn to value it as well. Don't treat me just like everybody else because you think it's fair. See me for who I am. Acknowledge my differences, acknowledge my uniqueness, and value that. Different is not deficient. It just is what it is. Now, returning to our quote, I am inclined to agree that we absolutely need to build bridges. The question becomes, build bridges to what? In the past, the notion of equality referenced giving marginalized folks a seat at the table. Now, mind you, this is a table that was created by those individuals in power, these same individuals that developed and maintained these racist and oppressive systems throughout our history. So, in my very humble opinion, we just need to throw that whole table away and build a new one. Individuals in power must build bridges that allow for people with marginalized identities to lend their voices and efforts to the construction of this new way of being. In Dr. Maisa Akbar's allyship identity model, this is known as brokering equity and requires us all to openly challenge oppressive and racist views, and for those in power to create, construct, and cross bridges between people of color and white people, all in the name of racial justice. So in closing, I challenge you all to think of what you can do to aid in the building of these bridges. Reflect on the things that you value and how you think about differences in the world. As you reflect on this dumpster fire of 2020, what are your feelings? Are they those of hope and optimism? Those of pessimism and disdain? Or those of anger and rage that serve to propel you to action? What comes up for you when you hear the names of Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, and countless others whose deaths and mistreatment led to global protests under the rallying battle cries of Black Lives Matter and No Justice, No Peace? How do you feel when the statistics concerning the maltreatment of Black, Indigenous, and people of color by the criminal justice system are discussed? These questions must be answered if we are ever going to work toward any sort of sustainable change. If we hope to bring forth King T'Challa's vision and pepper our world with bridges and dismantle barriers, it's going to take all of us. So ask yourself, what are you willing to do? Thank you very much for your attention.